Looking for a way to add additional seating to your movie room? How about a built-in bar? Here is how I DIY'd mine, the mistakes that I made, how I built it, and what I wish I would have done differently, as well as the full budget breakdown. And spoiler alert, I spent under $1,000 building this. A couple things to note before I got started on building my theater bar is my room is actually 19 feet wide by 22 feet deep, and it does have two different tiers, a plywood platform for one row of seating that then steps down onto the concrete. I wanted to have adequate open space to go down into those tiers, and so I left a 4-foot opening, which meant that out of that 19 feet, my island is 15 feet long and about 2 feet wide. So unfortunately, the only thing that I had to reference was how people built their kitchen islands. And so that's how I constructed this. I used 2x4s to build a pony wall with 2 small walls on each end to act as feet for the countertop. With the total length being 15 feet, I totally could have added an additional leg in the middle, which would have added additional support. I wrapped the entire theater bar in this white oak tongue and groove because I had it left over from another project. If I didn't have this material, I probably would have built the entire island bar out of plywood and then had it painted so that it looked like cabinetry as opposed to like this kind of rustic white oak looking vibe that I've got going on here. This is where we kind of got ahead of ourselves because we didn't factor in putting in the metal brackets before we added all of this white oak, which meant that we had to take off some of this white oak to be able to install the metal brackets. The problem with that is the metal brackets were about 1/4 of an inch thick, so they sat higher than the island bar. In hindsight, I would have taken my multi-tool or a router and cut out grooves. That way the metal pieces would have sat flush to the plywood and we wouldn't have had to do as much shimming, and it would have given our countertop a lot better support. But you learn your lessons doing DIY project, and so we had to make do with what we had.
So I'm gonna try to not tear the whole thing out, but I really want these to be supportive for our concrete countertops.
Because the bar is 15 feet by 2 feet, there aren't a lot of solid surface countertops that you can buy that'll fit that dimension. Most of the time you're gonna end up with a seam somewhere, which is totally fine.
To do is we're gonna end up ramset anchoring this whole thing down into the concrete, and then now we're gonna build like a concrete countertop for it. So this I did at my old house. It was super messy. So we're gonna plastic everything so that it doesn't get on the floors and it doesn't get on the wood. And then we have these forms. So I just chose like a regular square edge, but you can pick any of these edges, and the forms are plastic and they just snap off after it's cured. I'm so pumped about this. So last time I just used like a tool without a blade. They actually have an oscillating tool. So like this is what's gonna shake to get out all of the air bubbles so that it's nice and pretty. And they have it. They have literally everything you need. So the different grit sanding discs, get it nice and smooth. The trowels to work it. This is a screeder. So you just kind of go back and forth with it to get it level. This is for the sealer, the epoxy. These are the little clips that hold in the like, fiber mesh so that it's nice and strong.
So we masked off everything with plastic and tape because this is such a messy process.
So awesome. I love using that.
Makes you feel like a badass.
Yeah, it's just like,
I just went to the concrete with a bullet.
Surrounded by energies, most of which still remain a mystery. Not in spite of, because life flies. Nothing can exist without it. Darkness will exist. dissipate as we continue to age. Surrounded by energies, most of which still remain a mystery. Not in spite of, but because of life thrives. Nothing can exist without it. Darkness would persist.
Kids like K-pop demon hunters. I've got all the Z-clips in, fiber mesh, tape. You just have to make sure things like this get tucked in. I might cut that because that'll stick up. So this is the concrete that we're using, and I use the same thing at my old house. So it's actually a white concrete and made for countertops. And then we just got it set up. So 3 quarts of water to every 1 bag. We started with, there's 1 quart of water in here, and then we'll slowly add mix.
And then we started mixing the concrete. The consistency is a little bit tricky to get every single pour of concrete to be the same water content and thickness, even though we were measuring out our water. So I just want to give you that preface beforehand. And you definitely need 2, 3, maybe even 4 people for the actual pouring process, because you do need somebody who's actively mixing the concrete. You need to have all of the concrete poured and spread at a kind of quick rate. That way some of the concrete doesn't start to cure before you're adding the next concrete. You also want to spend a good amount of time spreading and smoothing out the concrete as good as possible, even though it is starting to harden and cure, because sanding it down to get it to be smooth, you do have to work the concrete quite a bit to get rid of all of the air bubbles. We made the mistake of thinking we could just sand some of it down, and we spent probably 6 hours sanding and barely made a dent in the areas that were a little bit high or low or rough or bumpy, which is why in the end I wasn't loving the end result. Decided to add an epoxy coating on top to help smooth everything out perfectly. So I ended up adding a little bit of house paint to it to give it this milky consistency, and so that it didn't just look like a completely transparent gloss. And I loved the way that it turned out. Epoxy does take a couple hours to dry, and in that process we had to go back with our scrapers and get rid of all of the extra drips that were coming off over the edge. Some of those could be like cut off with a razor blade after the fact, but we used our scraper the best that we could as it was curing, and then just let it dry. Now, once your countertops have cured, you can seal them with a concrete sealer, and then you're done. The epoxy is a 2-part system. Once you mix the 2 together is what activates it and allows it to basically pour and then harden and cure. If you only use part A or only use part B, it won't ever dry. The other thing that I did, and I watched a ton of different tutorials on it, was how people can take epoxy and they can basically turn them into looking like marble or granite by using different kinds of paints or spray paints to create veining, or sponge painting, or painting the surface and then pouring the epoxy on top. The only thing that we have left to do in this room now is to add some bar stools, move in all of the furniture, and get the projector up, and then we can call this project finished.